Hey, welcome to Down the Dopamine Hole. We're going to try something a little bit different today. A little interactive experiment, if you will. So, this is the only warning that you are going to get that you need to pay attention to what you're going to see. For those of you who are listening on Spotify, I will hook you up with a link if you want to see what we're going to talk about. For those of you that are on YouTube, this is the entire reason that you're here. You get to be the eyewitness to a crime today. Unfortunately, I'm not actually going to show you the crime. This is where your imagination comes in. Your job is to remember the six perpetrators of the crime that you have witnessed. There is no going back to look at them again, so no rewinding, no screenshotting, no cheating. All you have to rely on is your memory. So, for those of you out there that are ADHD, sorry, sucks for you. All right. In 1984, 22-year-old college student Jennifer Thompson was at home when a man broke into her apartment and sexually assaulted her. She couldn't fight back. She decided that she was going to stare at her attacker's face and she was going to memorize every single detail of his face so that she could identify him later. She identified him later, and based on her testimony, a man named Ronald Guertin was sentenced to life plus 54 years. His alibi was corroborated by family members. Another young woman who was attacked around the same time and in the same way did not pick Ronald out of a lineup. The second victim ended up picking another suspect out of the lineup. Ronald appealed based on this, and his appeal was denied. Ronald was retried for both of the assaults after the second victim changed her mind and stated that it was Ronald who actually committed the crime. Another inmate took credit for both assaults, but this evidence wasn't allowed to be heard in his second trial, and he ended up being convicted of both assaults. In 1995, after 10 and a half years in jail, his DNA was tested against the evidence that had been gathered during the crimes, and it was shown not to match, and he was cleared of all charges. Jennifer was absolutely convinced that it was Ronald. She stared at his face. She memorized every detail of his face. How could she be so wrong? By the way, the man who actually assaulted Jennifer Thompson was Bobby Poole. And here is what Ronald Guertin and Bobby Poole looked like at the time of the assault. Eyewitness testimony has been shown to be one of the most important aspects of law enforcement and especially court proceedings. But eyewitness testimony has been shown to be wrong in 70% of the cases in the US that have been exonerated through DNA evidence. So, should we just get rid of eyewitness testimony? Not necessarily. At one point in time, an eyewitness's confidence level of their identification was deemed to be really important as to the accuracy of the identification. However, after looking at the DNA exonerations, it was found that many of the eyewitnesses had really high levels of confidence in their eyewitness testimony. However, the thought then became that confidence levels had no bearing on accuracy. But that's not exactly true either. The problem with eyewitness testimony has more to do with the procedures of getting the identification than it does with the eyewitness themselves. There's been a lot of research that's been done on eyewitness identification, and there are certain things that have been found to increase the likelihood of accurate identifications. First, the officer that is in the room with the eyewitness should not know who the potential suspect is. What happens when the officer knows who the potential suspect is they have a tendency, either overtly or covertly, to influence the eyewitness to pick that suspect. If the officer doesn't know who they are, they can't give those types of clues. The second thing is that the lineup should only include the potential suspect and people who are known innocents. So only people that they know have never committed a crime. What happens is they often tend to fill lineups with people that they know have committed different crimes. So whoever the eyewitness picks, they're not going to be wrong. They may be wrong of that crime, but they're not going to be wrong in that whoever they pick committed a crime. It's kind of like taking a multiple choice test where all of the answers are at least partially right. And that's not a good thing. And if there's multiple potential suspects, Each suspect should have their own lineup with them and people that are known innocents. Innocents should match the description of the suspect, at least in terms of things like similar height, hair color, clothing, that type of thing, but should not look so similar to the suspect that it would be really difficult to tell them apart. The reason for this is if somebody says, "Oh, I know that the person that I saw had dark hair, there's 5 people in a lineup and 3 of them have blonde hair," that's not going to be super accurate and help them to determine if somebody's memory is accurate in who they saw. Witnesses should be cautioned that the suspect might not be in the lineup. Witnesses will often go into a lineup with the intention of choosing somebody, but with there only being one potential suspect in the lineup, that person may not be the actual person that the eyewitness saw. A confidence statement needs to be obtained if the eyewitness identifies a suspect. So, how confident are you in your identification? And the person needs to give them however they choose to do it. It could be I'm 95%, or on a scale of 1 to 10, maybe a 6, that type of thing. And that's really important for a lot of reasons. One is that we have found that if these procedures are used, that their confidence level does tend to correlate with accuracy. But the other thing is people have a tendency to inflate their confidence level of their identification over time. What starts off as a 65% might become a 90% by the time the court case actually comes. By getting a confidence level, it kind of tends to hold people a little bit more accountable. Or when people are in court and say, I was 90% sure that that was the person, it can be shown that that's not what they said at the time. There have been experiments that have been done based on different procedures that have been used. And there's also been field studies done at different police departments of hundreds of eyewitnesses to hundreds of crimes. And some of the lineups used the procedures that I just explained, and some of the lineups used different procedures. And what has been found is that when lineups use the procedures that I just described, confidence levels highly correlated with the accuracy of eyewitness identification. But when the procedures that I described were not used, those correlations didn't exist. So let's go back to Jennifer Thompson and Ronald Guertin. Jennifer Thompson is white and Ronald Guertin is black. And of the 70% of convictions that were overturned due to eyewitness testimony, 40% of them were cross-race identifications. And this, boys and girls, brings us to our psychological concept of the day. There is something that exists that is called the other race effect. Basically, people recognize faces of their own race much more easily than they recognize the faces of other races. The brain doesn't process faces of other races as distinctly or as accurately as our own race. We also tend to see faces of other races as more average looking, and this makes it difficult to remember details. And it also makes the people of other races more likely to all look alike, which I'm sure we've all heard at some point. It's not the fact that certain races have less variations among faces, because we know through research that that's not true. It has to do with a lack of knowledge and a lack of experience. And before you sit there and tell me, like, are you saying that I lack knowledge? Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. We all have the same features in terms of we all have 2 eyes and we all have a nose and a mouth and a forehead and a chin and cheekbones and all that kind of stuff. The thing is, though, is that the individual features themselves and the proportions between the features and how everything is set up on our face tends to differ from race to race. So the patterns of our facial features tend to differ from race to race. We tend to learn the patterns of the faces of our own race, but the patterns of the faces of other races tend to be more difficult for us if we are not around people of other races a lot. To test this, researchers actually took pictures of 2 people from different races, with one of the pictures being from the subject's own race. So, like if I was the subject, one of the pictures would be of a white person and one would be of a person of another race. They used what was called a face inversion experiment. They took the picture of the white person, for example, and they would put that white person right side up their face, like not them, the picture of the face, right side up. And then they would take the picture of the face and they would put it upside down. They also would do the same thing with a picture of a person from another race. And they would see what it took for me to actually recognize that picture. And what they found is that when I'm looking at a face, not me personally, I never was in this experiment, but when I'm looking at the face of the person of my own race, right side up, that I tend to look at this face holistically. I tend to look at the pattern of the face, and that allows me to identify someone. I look at it as a whole. Like one part of my brain works and basically says, like, looks at the picture and goes, oh, that's Amy. Okay. But when I'm looking at an inverted face, I have to look at all of the individual features of that face and figure out how they go together and then figure out how to identify that person, which takes three parts of my brain, a lot more energy, and is a lot more data points and is a lot more difficult. But interestingly, what they found is that when I look at a person of another race, I use that same way of identifying, that same three parts of my brain method, and looking at individual features instead of looking at it holistically, whether or not the picture of that face is right side up or upside down. You can imagine if it's that much more difficult, if there's that many more data points, if it takes that much more brain power, it's going to be harder for me to remember what that person looks like. So let's go back to the faces that you looked at the beginning of the episode. I'm going to show you 6 sets of pictures, and you need to see if you can pick out the suspects from the earlier pictures. And yes, unlike some police lineups, each set of pictures contains one of the suspects. So, how well did you do? Research states that you should have been able to recognize the person of your race more easily than people of other races. Was that true of you? Feel free to tell me how you did in the comments below, by the way. For those of you listening, or those of you who just want to see the criminals and photos again, I'm going to put them all at the end of this episode. So, what does this mean for eyewitness testimony? Research shows that when witnesses work with a sketch artist, or more recently, more often, computer artists, to develop a likeness of the suspect, a holistic method tends to be more accurate than a feature based method. Feature based methods happen when someone describes each of the facial features to the computer artist, and they then pick from a database of different facial features and they add that and then make a composite out of it. There's several problems with this. One is that we're taking a visual memory, which is how we store memories of faces, obviously, and we're trying to describe that verbally, which can be really hard for people to do. The other thing is that depending on how we identify somebody, we don't always identify somebody based on features sometimes. The holistic method, though, is where you can look through a database of faces and you can start off with the face that is the most similar to the face that you saw. The benefit of this is that you stored the memory visually, so then you're able to use your visual sense to be able to find a face that's very similar. Then you're able to have the computer artist tweak individual parts of the face to become more similar to what it is that you saw. Or holistically, you can use things like age, like he's older, and then holistically, the computer model will actually make the entire face older. Or you could say they're bigger and it would make, the entire face bigger, that type of thing. But you can just keep working until it becomes satisfactory to you. But the problem with that is we don't identify everybody holistically. Remember, we identify people from other races by feature. One of those tends to be more accurate, the holistic method, but yet we don't identify everybody holistically. So there tends to be a problem there. What is the best, or basically the only, way to decrease the other race effect? It's to go hang out with people that don't look like you. Research shows that the more experience you have with other races, the more you will learn the patterns of their faces and you will process their faces holistically, just like you do with the faces of your own race. And no, we shouldn't do this so we can be better eyewitnesses against them in the future. We should do this because getting to know people who are different than you makes you a better fucking human being now. Eyewitness testimony often feels like the gold standard of evidence. I mean, who knows better what happened during a crime than an eyewitness, other than maybe the criminal, but they're probably not going to talk about what happened. The catch is that human memory does not work like a video camera. It's kind of more like a storyteller. It fills in gaps, it smooths over details, and a lot of times it kind of takes artistic license. Stress, poor lighting, the passage of time, and even leading questions can all influence what people remember. This doesn't mean that eyewitnesses are unreliable on purpose, because they're not. It just means that our brains are trying to make sense of a really complicated event with extremely limited information and a lot of interference. One factor that can affect eyewitness accuracy is the other race effect, which is the tendency for people to be better at recognizing and distinguishing faces from their own racial and ethnic backgrounds than from racial and ethnic groups that they don't experience as often. Think of your brain as like a facial recognition program, and it gets really good at the faces that it sees all the time. But it struggles when it sees less familiar faces. And as a result, people can sometimes have a harder time telling apart individuals from other racial groups, which can lead to identification errors. The other race effect is a reminder that memory isn't just about paying attention. It's also about how easily our brains can organize information. So we'd all like to think that we would make excellent witnesses and we have stellar memories, but most of us would probably discover that our mental perception is a little bit fuzzier than we would hope. That's all I have for today. I hope you learned something new and I hope you enjoyed your time with me today. Hit all the buttons, subscribe, be notified when I come out with new content, all that good stuff. I am going to show the photos as well as the photo lineups again. So hang out for a little bit, but be safe, take care of yourself, be happy. But most importantly, stay weird.